Well, hey folks, morning. This is our check-in. I figured I'd just record this and put it out there with some thoughts on bluegrass and bluegrass festivals that take place in places we might not always expect, and to also have us think about the effects of these events and our participation in them that might extend beyond the festival grounds into other parts of life. And the Gardner article that I asked y'all to read is a big part of that, and we'll look at some other things as well. Before we do that, though, I wanted to just bring us to the course schedule quickly and commend to you all these events that are happening next week on September 29th, and then on the 30th. There are two panels that I'm helping coordinate as a part of the International Bluegrass Music Association World of Bluegrass Festival that's going on. This string band symposium thing that I've helped coordinate for the past few years there. We have those going on again. The panels are going to happen this year as well, but they're going to be online, and it's exciting because you all can take place or can take part. And the first day there are going to be presentations of the kind of material that we learned and teach every day here at ETSU in BLUE, uh, with some folks from other places, so you can see how Bluegrass U happens elsewhere. And then the second day is going to feature four scholars who are doing research on bluegrass and bluegrass related music, so you can get a sense of what the research in the field is doing. And I'll bring up one of those in a bit. So I highly encourage you all to take part in those if you can. And there will be recordings of those and Facebook streaming of it as well. So lots of chances to take those in. There'll be some good stuff happening. So this gentleman who we're considering this week is Robert Gardner. So he is a sociologist. And one of the things that means, just in general, sociologists like to look at things from the 5,000 or 10,000 or 20,000 feet level. They like to look at big data. They like to think about the reasons that people are doing what they're doing. And we talked a little bit about Peterson, again, a sociologist, looking for the patterns, the industrial patterns that are going on with the creation of country music back in the day. And here, Robert Gardner he zooms in a little bit, and I think first of all, he's dealing with contemporary situations, and he himself is a bluegrass musician. And so he's talking about situations that he personally knows and takes part in. So he's a lot closer than Peterson to what he's writing about and the people with whom he's thinking and playing and doing. So I want to take us to another spot here, which is this NPR story. So take a listen to it. It brings up some interesting things. It's an economic story. It's just funny to have bluegrass come up on this national news site with a 7-minute report, not a short one, but this story about activity in the Colorado area in bluegrass festivals. So one of the things to consider here is a lot of wealth in Colorado and a lot of activity related to bluegrass. And Mercer, the reporter for this story, calls it a musical epicenter. And Gardner notes a lot of the significant amount of activity related to bluegrass that are happening in the Rocky Mountain scene. And there is a really interesting situation that in Colorado in 2011, when this report came out, festivals were doing well out there. And at the same time, and since then, there are many festivals in the East or in other situations that have closed. And in our current COVID situation, um, who knows what's going to happen, right? So I wanted to start out by asking y'all to take a listen to this different perspective from an economic standpoint on what festivals do and how they happen, and how does the scene in which the festival happened make a difference. So coming back to Gardner here, at this point he was at UC Boulder. He's now at a smaller institution at Infield College, just just so you know. So he talks about the Rocky Mountain Bluegrass scene, the RMBS, and he talks about that not just as a place or as a location, but as a mobile collection of individuals united around a mutual interest in bluegrass music and culture. And his ethnographic exploration of these bluegrass festival settings in the American West examines the ties that bind this mobile and transient grouping of individuals and discusses the motives underlying their participation. That's the sociologist part, right? Looking at the motives. So he says that individuals out there participate in this community for reasons that transcend the music itself and reasons that encompass the Bluegrass Festival as an intimate and communal cultural experience. He says that members respond to the difficulties of finding community at home by forming networks and bonds that simulate traditional forms of community life. Through temporary and transitory means, these communal relations fill a void in their lives. So, first of all, ethnography, uh, writing culture, culture writing, ethno meaning culture, people, and then writing, graphy. So that's a kind of a fancy word for someone who's paying attention to and trying to record and document and interpret what's going on out there. And that's actually one of the words I use to describe myself. We'll be talking more about that as a methodology and as an idea as time goes on. So think about it. We live in an increasingly mobile society. Some of us in this class are from states very far from Tennessee. There have definitely been folks in this class over the years who have been from different countries who are very, very far from Tennessee. And we're able to go to a different state, to a different country, to study, to learn, to work. So we are definitely mobile. At the same time, Gardner is saying we maintain an especially strong attachment to home and home places. I've found that people who are from Michigan really have a Michigan identity. I've noticed that among our students in the BLUE program. The folks who come here from Michigan are like, yeah, Michigan. And again, I think that's common with a lot of us, even if we're from Tennessee, we have, or just from East Tennessee, we have these affiliations and ideas of self and identity that really have a lot to do with a sense of place and a sense of home. One of the ideas that I learned about on reading this article is this idea of residential communities and of experiential communities. So a residential community is somewhere where you live, sort of this neighborhood around where I live. We could think of that as the Mountain Home neighborhood. Uh, it's the residential community or the larger community of Johnson City. Now, the experiential community is one in which you're not sharing geography or spatial presence, but experiential presence. I've been looking on Mandolin Cafe recently, and that's a community that's formed through the common experience of mandolin nerddom. Banjo hangout, there you go. All the banjos you could ever want or not want. The experience of banjo is what holds all those folks together. And it's interesting, there's 5-string players, old time players, you got 4-string tenor banjo players all hanging out with their common banjo experience. And all sorts of micro variations of banjo experience as well. So those experiential communities can happen in in-person geographically proximate ways, but they can also happen through Zoom and through websites and social media. So, how do we resolve that divide? I'm sure we all have our own ways of growing and maintaining community and connections with people in our immediate proximity, socially and spatially, but also with maintaining relationships with people with whom we have shared experiences. And that's one of the things that he's really getting at in this article. He talks about the public sphere, and I wanted to just explain that a little bit. If you think about the private sphere, that's kind of where I am right now, this little bubble of our home where we're spending a lot of time these days. And then the public sphere would be things that happen outside of that. My work at ETSU is much more public. It's a publicly funded institution, and it's a state institution. It's part of the public sphere. If we were to go down to City Hall here, that would be part of the public governmental sphere, and just things that happen out there in the world. And there are also parts of the public sphere that go in between the private and the public. There you can have institutions that exist in like clubs or interest groups that happen. If you think about the school, I was thinking about our son's elementary school. That's a government-funded institution. There are laws that exist. The public trust and welfare is maintained through legislation and policy and action related to public schools. At the same time, a lot of action at the school happens in a sort of semi-official way. Things like a PTA is a it's you could think of it as a club. It's an interest group, and it's parents, teachers who are interested in helping out and doing fundraising for the school. So it's not a governmental organization. It's kind of in between. So it's not necessarily a strong institution or a super official institution, but it's one that can have a lot of effects on teachers, on the school, and on students' experiences. And one of the big things that Gardner is saying is that mobility and community are not incompatible, that we can have really serious and good experiences from even though we're not all together with people in one place living in a neighborhood. One of Gardner's main arguments is that mobility, our current modern situation, and community are not necessarily incompatible. They can happen. We can have community even as mobile beings. He also talks about scenes. This is an important part of his discussion. It's in the Rocky Mountain bluegrass scene he's trying to describe. He calls that lifestyle and behavior patterns well known to a group of actors. Another term we could use is local scene or global scene, or one term that I like that some musicologists have used is the idea of a translocal scene. Like bluegrass, you have the whole large-scale discourse, the videos that go to everybody, the news that's spread worldwide about the music. But then you have the local variations, the local groups, the ways that bluegrass is something that has a local body. The hands and feet of bluegrass are hitting the ground in different places. So it has this idea of locality and translocal communication. So the local and the global level are both a part of how the music happens. Anyhow, Gardner introduces his background, I think, in a good way. This section of this article is a good model, as is Frisch's model on introducing himself. And Michelle Kislick's, the article that you'll read soon, is also another good example for you as you think about how you will introduce yourself in the paper that you'll write for this course. So you might look back on how he introduces himself and think about how you'll do that. What are his methods? He talks about quantitative and qualitative word-based study, along with participant observation engagement. So he's there as a participant. He's picking, he's talking, he's eating, he's living in the camps here at the festival, and he's also observing what's going on. He's also recording natural conversations and getting data from coding the transcripts of these interviews for keywords and themes, what are the words that people use? What are the ideas that they tend to come back to most often in how they talk about the experiences of the festival? And as he analyzes this data, he finds vocabularies of motive. What are the terms that people use? What are the habits of discussion that they have? And what are the rhetorics of motive, the larger frameworks in which people structure their experience and discuss their motives? So he's looking at the purposes. Again, this is the sociologist side of him, I think. He's trying to figure out what makes it all work. Why are people making the choices that they do? So one of the things he discusses is diversity and inclusivity. Most of the scene he encounters there is white. Many of the folks are female who are on the scene there, but in terms of race, it's pretty homogenous. And he talks about the narcissism of similarity, that we want to be together with people who are like us. It has more to do with similarity, perhaps, than narcissism. He says that interest groups are usually very similar. Biker groups, veteran groups. There are the experiential factors that are common, but also there are probably other things that are common besides that primary interest that would draw people together in an experiential community. You could think about the dining clientele at a restaurant or at the Johnson City Country Club, or the contra dance down in Jonesboro. What are the things that would be the common things between folks in this community or in this group, and what are some things that might show a little more variation? And thinking about race in string band music, what are the factors that might accompany that diversity or lack of diversity? All right, so that's sort of a side note. And he gets into the rhetorics of motive that he identifies through his analysis. Intimacy, inclusion, and simplicity. Those are the three main things. This might be on a quiz. So, intimacy, the feel of a campground or a single campsite, or a jam that happens at one of these places. Natural is a term that people used a lot, just relaxed or not pretentious. In some ways, these might be A-word type things. Real, not pretense, something like that. One of those definitions from Peterson might make sense in this way. And he talks about the change over the course of a festival weekend. There might be more bleed through from normal life at the beginning, fencing off of campsites, trying to maintain boundaries like we do with our houses and yards in our normal life. But then there might later, things are more open, and the campsites are more porous, and people are just coming and going through everywhere, and everyone's with each other in the community. Inclusion, it's interesting. He talks about there almost being rules that people should be included, that there's an ethos of inclusion, that behavior and sociality are almost policed, and people would say, hey, like we need to, let's more pointedly include this person in what's going on. Another bit of the vocab that was really common is this idea of simplicity. I think this is a really big factor in BLUE and string band music today in general. We often play acoustic instruments or older instruments, simpler instruments. The banjo is not a simple instrument in terms of its mechanics, or neither of any of the other instruments, but we have ideas of simplicity, that we don't have amplifiers. We have something that's a little more old-fashioned. So I think that resonates with me when I think about it. Simplicity is one of the things that's a part of my aesthetic and my ethos. And it's something that comes through in the general festival activities, right? That people are leaving behind all the complexities of life. They might even switch off their smartphones. They leave behind their office computers. They don't necessarily have a lot of the responsibilities of the weekday life. And life is simplified here in the festival. Another idea, you might think of Peterson's definition of authenticity as relic, not changed. So we're getting back to an older way of being, potentially. Being outdoors and cooking over a cast iron stove on an open flame. Maybe there's an idea of rusticity or getting back to something that used to happen that's a part of this idea or feeling of simplicity. Or people might be motivated towards something that feels more simple. Now, in thinking about these categories, he gets into a discussion of institution light, Lite. This is from Irvine in 1999, an article by the scholar. And he talks about this as a supplemental community, not a replacement. It's an emergent form of community similar to social networking or other online forms of sociality that are huge for us in our society in general, and especially during the COVID time that we're in right now. Now, the fact that it's contingent or not quite central in people's lives doesn't make it ineffective. Gardner continues, quote, individuals search for novel ways to meet the needs that traditional social groups and relationships once met. These lowercase I institutions, or institutions light, offer individuals all the benefits of an institution, but without all of the obligations. Because the Rocky Mountain Bluegrass scene made few demands on participants outside the festival, they return home or move on to the next event with relative freedom. Rather than merely replace religion, family, and community, the festival provides spaces where participants can freely celebrate these traditional institutions and activities and experience them without their associated burdens and boundaries. So they're light, fewer burdens, right? Then I was thinking this is like being a part of a church, attending multiple services per week, volunteering to fix the roof, bringing food for a church supper, taking care of an older person who's in the congregation, singing in the choir, all the things you would do if you were really involved in this institution, capital I, institution, in a geographical proximate kind of way. But you can also sit at home and listen to gospel music in your headphones and still be spiritually moved. You can feel connected to a community of saints or a community of faith or a feeling. And so that would be more like an institution light kind of experience. It's no less real, but it happens in a different way. And it has different effects. Again, that's that sociological idea that we have going on here. Now, does that mean, because they're Lite, that bluegrass festivals aren't important in social terms? I followed this rabbit hole a little bit and looked up Irvine's 1999 article. He discusses Codependence Anonymous, 12-step meetings, similar to Alcoholics Anonymous and so on. And he calls them institution, Lite, light. Now, these 12-step programs are hugely important for a lot of people who struggle with addiction or other things. This can be the core of a person's identity. So even though it's Lite, it can be hugely significant and life-changing for someone and transformative. So how does festival behavior and experience matter for folks outside the calendric, the it happens only once a year setting of festivals? Do inclusion, intimacy, and simplicity creep into other parts of life, or what Gardner calls the Sittlichkeit communities of daily life? Does the woman who was greeted 5 times on the way to the Porta-John and felt really welcomed in the community change in some way, that in her daily life she's quicker to greet others in her office or to be more hospitable and forbearing when she's on her morning commute and there's road rage all around? This is the idea of participating in community and not being passive, perhaps. Maybe that's what we learn as being part of a bluegrass festival group. One of the presenters in the Bluegrass Symposium scholarship panel next week is going to be talking about how she studies bluegrass jam situations where people who are participating have disabilities. And she has been thinking about ways that we might learn from how people in bluegrass settings help these folks to participate in a full way in the community and in the sound and music experience, and how we might learn from that in society at large. How could we be more effective in including people with disabilities in normal life? So I think there are some ways that we can make some connections between what's happening in the music, or learn from what happens in the music and apply it elsewhere in society. So are there other outcomes in this whole experience? One thing I think about it, going back to the radio show that I asked y'all to listen to, the economic effects of participation are huge. When people feel welcomed, when they become enfolded by this community and they want to take part, they need to equip themselves, not only with camping equipment and coolers and so on, tiki torches, but they also need blue chip picks. They need well-crafted luthier-made small shop instruments. And all of a sudden, they are part of the economic driving of the community, this sustainability in bluegrass that has kept going even through the economic crisis that happened after 2008, as that report discusses. So one other thing I wanted y'all to think about before we finish: what are the intersections of Gardner's ideas with some of the other authors we've read and been thought about so far? Does the diversity and inclusivity of festivals play out in a way that's like the rooms in the Bluegrass House? Are there different parts of the community where people feel more accepted, or where their ethos is more in line with other folks? Are there parts like the hippie hill of a festival where there's certain kind of things that go on, or certain things are emphasized over others? One of the ideas of realness or authenticity that comes in here is this idea of the degree of realness of the institution. Is it LITE, or is it more heavy, or brick and mortar? Does it have some sort of gravitational pull to it? How real is the community? And I think these ideas of authenticity could be a part of how we consider or give weight to these activities and their small I institutions. And one of the things that I think about is how we might do some research that might continue what Gardner was doing. We could contact him and ask him for the kind of questions he was asking. This is what I'm thinking about as I'm getting approval for the survey that we'll do in this class. What are the questions we'll ask, and how will that affect the information that we get? One thing that Gardner doesn't really seem to talk about at all is the actual music that's played. We don't really have a sense of, is this really trad bluegrass that's being played? Are people playing a bunch of Western swing? Is there contest fiddling going on? Is it all like blues tunes in C? We don't really know. And I think there's more that could be done to link the kind of sociological elements that he's talking about with actual musical stuff. And I think that's something that folks in our program are really poised to do, because we all deal with musical details. And that's something that you can think about when you're working on your project. You might be sure to incorporate musical details. I look forward to hearing what you think about this situation in this article, but I think that Michelle Kislik does a better job of actually including musical detail in her account of jamming at bluegrass festivals. So that might be another example of something that's more musically oriented. So I look forward to hearing what you think about this article and in the discussion forums, and I hope you all are doing all right. Talk to you soon.